Greetings, scholars. We just finished Washington Adams. Now we're going to start talking about Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and then John Quincy Adams. And at the same time, we're going to meet Andrew Jackson. So let's get this started. I'm going to, again, try to keep these videos down to about 30 minutes apiece. Coffee. Okay, the Republican president, like I showed you earlier, between George Washington and Adams, the two Federalists, who are the first two presidents, then we wind up for the next 24 years, Republican presidents, all three from Virginia. Even though Washington was also from Virginia, I think this part is most telling. Okay, what we're going to look at in this chapter, Jefferson's presidency, section called "The Republicans in a Dangerous World," the War of 1812, the status of women in the early republic, and then we'll look at Madison's and his successors. Okay, this is sort of the outline of what we're going to talk about with Jefferson's presidency, the election. We'll talk about Jefferson's vision of what Republican-style government looks like. We'll talk about the judiciary and midnight judges, as well as the Lewis and Clark expedition and Louisiana Purchase. Okay. The text refers to Jefferson's presidency as the Revolution of 1800. Thomas Jefferson referred to it as the Revolution of 1800 because in Jefferson's mind, the kinds of changes that are going to take place, especially in the executive branch, with his entrance to the presidency and Adams' exit, if it would have happened in Europe, would have required a bloody revolution. But Jefferson at this point has come to believe that the Constitution, as a limiting document, allowed for both of these governing philosophies to exist simultaneously. Okay? But Jefferson recognizes what's going to happen is going to be something different at this point. Okay? A peaceful transference of power from Federalist to Republican ideals. Okay? However, even though this is Jefferson's ideology, Jefferson could and would use the power of this central government when he felt it was necessary. So there's a lot of that still going on here. Okay? Now, this election of 1800, you've got Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, who are the two individuals from this sort of Republican philosophy. The Federalists are going to run the incumbent president, who is John Adams, and John Jay, the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. John Jay has to step down from the court so that he can run for president, but this is what's going to happen. Now, Adams is going to head the Federalist ticket as the incumbent, okay? And that's fine in New England because the people in New England have the same ideals and the same notions as Adams does. However, he's made enemies in the Congress, especially with those people who believe he's made too many concessions to the French during the Quasi-War and the XYZ affair. The middle and southern states, they have other plans. Being led by Alexander Hamilton, they are going to put another candidate forward. So instead of 4 names that we would select to, now there's going to be 5 names. What Hamilton believed this would do, by putting C.C. Pinckney in as a 5th person for the presidency, he believed with his denunciations of Adams in the press, they would be able to squeeze Adams out of the ticket, and C.C. Pinckney, as well as John Jay, would be the 2 Federalists that would head the ticket. Well, it's going to turn out badly for them. It reveals some serious division within the Federalist camp. As I said before, if you watch the short video of, I think it's instructive. I put the little YouTube video of Adams and Jefferson's campaign speeches. Now, those speeches weren't delivered exactly like that, but all of those things that the two men called each other were in fact taken from a number of their writings and their speeches that were given during that time period. What's instructive, though, at the end of John Adams' speech, Adams attacks Alexander Hamilton. Why? Because Alexander Hamilton was working under the table to make sure Adams would not be president again. Now, it's going to come to no avail because Adams really doesn't have a chance at this point. The election boils out like this. Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr with 73 electoral votes apiece. John Adams with 65 electoral votes. C.C. Pinckney with 64 electoral votes. And John Jay with only 1 electoral vote. I guess most people remember Jay's treaty and believe that John Jay isn't the guy. So instead of squeezing Adams out by adding Pinckney to a ticket, it just squeezed John Jay out. Now, not a big surprise that Adams lost the election. It wasn't a big surprise. The big surprise was that Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson tied. Most people believe that Burr would have conceded, allowed Jefferson to be president, and he would have been vice president. But Aaron Burr is very opportunistic. Aaron Burr decides, wait a minute, I got as many electoral votes as Thomas Jefferson did. Why can't I be president and he go back to being vice president again? This is going to cause a conflict. However, when this situation occurs constitutionally, when no one has a clear majority of the Electoral College, the vote has to go to the House of Representatives. Now, it only goes between the 2 top people. So there are no Federalists in this vote that goes to the House of Representatives. However, the House is predominantly Federalist. And so since it is predominantly Federalist, Alexander Hamilton has a great deal of sway. So in comes Hamilton, arguing against Burr for Jefferson. Not necessarily because he likes Thomas Jefferson, because Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton are both politicians, lawyers from New York. They have met before. They have encountered each other before. They are, I guess, rivals would almost make it too mild for what they are. And I wouldn't really call them enemies, at least not yet. Okay? But Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton aren't friends. Okay? So Hamilton starts talking down. At least when Thomas Jefferson says something, whether you agree with it or not, you can pretty much be sure that it's the truth. Aaron Burr will lie to your face and stab you in the back when you turn around. And all these kinds of things that Hamilton says about Burr. Well, what happens? The House votes. Thomas Jefferson is elected president. Aaron Burr becomes the vice president. We have our peaceful transition of power like Thomas Jefferson believed, but what we also have is clearly this sort of politics under the table, this kind of thing that Alexander Hamilton was good at, this kind of activity. Now, Jefferson's idea of government is clearly contrasted to the Federalist ideals. Right? From his inauguration on, it's different. Both George Washington and John Adams both stayed in the same boarding house. It has become a tradition. They stay in the boarding house the night before the inauguration. When Washington and Adams had their inaugurations, there were big parades and there was pomp and circumstance and there was all of this stuff going on. When Thomas Jefferson has his inauguration, Jefferson wakes up, he puts on his regular clothes, he goes outside and walks to where the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and a small group of witnesses are. He swears and takes the oath of office, and then he goes back to the boarding house. It's time to start work. Jefferson doesn't see himself as some kind of an aristocrat. He sees himself as a citizen who for a short period is charged with leading the government. He supports the Constitution. He's not an anti-federalist, but he sees too much power in the executive branch, primarily from Hamilton's doing. He didn't like Hamilton's vision of funding the public debt, of creating the national bank, and exclusive commercial ties with England to the exclusion of the other countries. Thomas Jefferson was what the French would call a physiocrat. Our wealth, our prosperity is dependent upon our agrarian output. And as many markets as we can have is what we need. Hamilton was almost more exclusively tied to English commerce. Okay? Jefferson is going to start to dismantle this federalist system almost from the beginning. Almost from the beginning. Okay? His idea of a central government, the true source of freedom is small, independent farmers. If every American could own 160 acres and they could plant their cash crop and then take that cash crop to market and sell it on a global market, as far as Jefferson was concerned, that meant every man was the king of his own castle. He was the king of his own. He made his own wealth. And so for Jefferson, this is the kind of idea. This is what the true source of American freedom was going to be. So Jefferson didn't see us as moving forward in manufacturing and industrialization. Jefferson saw us as filling a niche. In America, we've got so many resources, so much material, so many things that can be harvested. Nowhere in the world has what we have. Jefferson believed if we became the marketplace to the world, this is how we would feel our niche, and no one would be able to compete with us. Hamilton's ideal was that since we have resources here, we need to start manufacturing our own goods. And so by manufacturing our own goods, it puts us in direct competition with Europe and the rest of these countries. And by doing so, we will compete on this global market, and we will start doing the manufacturing and things like that. So both of these guys have these differing visions. For Jefferson, however, land was that which was important. The physiocrats believed that the true wealth, real estate, is land. We still call it real estate when you go to buy a house. So the true source of freedom, small independent farmers. He wants to sponsor a land giveaway, 50 acres to every landless white man in the country. Okay, this was kind of radical even for the time. Next thing he does is he immediately reduces the size of the army down to 3,000 soldiers, 3,000 men in a standing army. That's about a third of what it was at the end of Adams' administration. He's also going to reduce our Navy from those 12 frigates that have been built down to 7. The 7 frigates will serve as sort of a coast guard, and those other frigates will have the cannons removed, and they will be used as the merchant marine. They will haul goods across the ocean back and forth for government purposes, the merchant marine. Okay? The defense of this country, he said, is a well-regulated militia. This idea that every citizen, according to Jefferson and to Madison, every citizen forms a militia who are well-equipped and well-trained, will provide the defense for themselves. That's what this notion was. Okay? Now, many people complain because we're having difficulties. We're having difficulties now with not only the French and the British, but also over in the Mediterranean with the Barbary pirates. And to cut our Navy down to this diminished size of only 7 main ships, it's going to be hard for us to protect the shipping that's going on in the Mediterranean as they're getting attacked. Eventually, in Jefferson's administration, he's going to be approached by these Barbary pirates, and they are going to demand extortion money to keep from attacking our shipping. Washington and Adams both had paid monies, almost $1 million at this point, to these Barbary pirates to stop them from attacking our ships. You can look up on Yale University's Avalon Project, George Washington, and then later John Adams' Treaties of Tripoli. When Jefferson comes into office, Jefferson says, we'll give not 1 penny to criminals not to attack our ships. And the first thing that happens is they capture one of our cargo ships in the Mediterranean. This is where Thomas Jefferson sends the Marines. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. This is when the Marines go in, Stephen Decatur, and they rescue those sailors who had been captured by the Barbary pirates. And Jefferson dictates terms. If you attack our ships again, we will be back. We will be back. They, well, it was clearly a different kind of administration from the two previous. Now, Jefferson's idea of government was to abolish all internal federal taxes. Population tax, which became a big plus for the South because the South had this larger population. The whiskey tax will also be abolished. Customs and revenues from the sale of Western lands were going to be what was used to finance the government. That means the government was going to wind up being functioning within its limits, functioning within its budgetary limits. Jefferson's idea of a government was this. A properly limited government has a postal service. It has federal courts which have to be paid for. It will staff lighthouses, right, because commerce is important. You've got to keep the ships safe. It will also collect customs on imported items where you have to pay import taxes. And also conducting the census. As I've said before, there are census jobs open. Get on out there. Pays good money. And conducting the census, very important for Thomas Jefferson. The federal government, especially the executive branch, goes from employing 130 people to less than a couple of dozen. Most of the 100 people who lose their job come from the executive branch around the Treasury Department. Thomas Jefferson is dismantling this monolith in the Treasury Department that Alexander Hamilton had created. Now, what?
8 minutes.
Okay, I don't have time to keep within the 30-minute time limit to talk about these things that happened just before Thomas Jefferson comes into office. We've talked about this before. Between the time of the election and the time the president takes office, back then it was 5 months. So the election is in November. You don't come to office until March. So between that time, John Adams is still president, and these Federalists realize things are about to change, and they're going to try to solidify their power base any way they can. And so when we start with the next one, we'll talk about that.